You're listening to the Sea Change podcast, covering the trends and issues in Southeast Asia.
Welcome to the Sea Change podcast. My name is Nick Basson. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Connors, who is the Australian Financial Review's Southeast Asia correspondent and will be joining us from Singapore. Emma has an extensive background and a lot of experience in journalism, having spent time covering stories across Australia, Asia and the UK. To begin today's conversation, Emma, it'd be fantastic to understand a bit more about your experiences in Southeast Asia and what drew you to the region.
Well, I have been in journalism for a long time, and I've done different areas. I started off really as a tech writer, and you know that was a great start. It sort of got me to the Financial Review, and also gave me a lot of international travel. I was based in London for a while, and because of the tech industry, you know, I went to the US quite a lot, Silicon Valley, the East and West Coast. So really my interest in Southeast Asia came later, probably in the second half of my career. Like most Australians, you know, I've done some travel here. I've never went to Bali, but I've always sort of been fascinated by Vietnam and Thailand. But from a work point of view, it was really when I started working at Lowy, which was 2015, that I just started to really get fascinated by just how different the region is and how different these sort of 10, you know, if we talk about the 10 Asian countries are. And their relationship with Australia and how that is very idiosyncratic according to which country it is, and just the history of the place is so fascinating. You know, it's so diverse. You know, of course, we all grew up, well, you probably didn't, but I did, you know, grew up with the Vietnam War. I know there's the Korean War on monuments as well. And, of course, you know, we remember back from the Second World War, you know, we're still getting novelists talking about, you know, the Satakan death marches and stuff through Borneo. But then you look at Thailand, you know, which let the Japanese sort of traverse its northern tip, but really has managed to remain independent for most of its history. And you compare that, you know, to Indonesia, which, of course, had the Dutch, and Malaysia and Singapore, which had the Brits, Philippines, where the Americans were. It's just so fascinating how these countries, what they've done since independence, you know, if you take Thailand out of the mix, but, you know, how the region has sort of evolved so quickly, really, and in living memory.
Yeah, you talk about that evolving idea of Southeast Asia, working in the region at the moment. Obviously, we've had COVID, which has decimated quite a lot of the countries. There's a bit stronger recovery coming out of there. Some of the highest growth rates in the world are located in Southeast Asia at the moment. In your opinion, what kind of countries have been exceeding expectations? We talk about Vietnam. They've recovered quite strongly after a slowdown in manufacturing. But what other countries and kind of...
Yeah, look, I think we have to lead with Indonesia, you know, the biggest...
You talk about that evolving idea of Southeast Asia, working in the region at the moment. Obviously, we've had COVID, which has decimated quite a lot of the countries. There's a bit stronger recovery coming out of there. Some of the highest growth rates in the world are located in Southeast Asia at the moment. In your opinion, what kind of countries have been exceeding expectations? We talk about Vietnam. They've recovered quite strongly after a slowdown in manufacturing. But what other countries and kind of...
Yeah, look, I think we have to lead with Indonesia, you know, the biggest economy by far here. If you look at Indonesia's history since the late sort of 1990s and the beginning of, you know, its modern democratic path, I guess you could say. It's sort of had, you know, reasonably steady growth of sort of about 5%, but there's always been this sense with Indonesia, like with India, that it was about to take off, and then something would happen that would mean it didn't take off. So I think, you know, everyone was a bit wary about what would happen this year, and of course, at the beginning of the year, it was still quite locked down. You know, Bali was late to open back up to international visitors. I don't think that was till April, till second quarter. But it's really come sort of roaring out of the blocks, Indonesia. And it's had such a great year internationally with the G20 and the way it's handled that. I think its profile has really increase. I think a lot of countries that didn't pay much attention to Indonesia before now are. And if you look at the economy, I mean, it's done really well. It's still ahead in terms of where most thought it would be at this point. The big question is if it can ride out the downturn that is happening in most of the major markets, so obviously in Europe and the US and China as well, right? I mean, China is always the big influencer on the region in trade. And, you know, we're not sure. It now looks just in recent days as if that COVID zero may be relieved perhaps earlier than next year, which is what most economists were looking to. So if that happens and growth picks up again in China, that'd be really good news for Indonesia. If it doesn't, then Indonesia, this could be one of those waves that sends it back again next year. But at the minute, I think, you know, it's certainly performing really well. It's got really good surplus balance of payment because mainly of its strong energy exports and those strong prices for commodities this year. The one sort of dark cloud on the horizon is the rupiah, which has depreciated quite sharply. And this is a really sensitive issue for Indonesia. I don't know if you know, but there's actually a central bank, a Bank Indonesia museum in Jakarta.
Yeah, I'm aware. Haven't gone there yet, but it's one of the main tourist attractions.
Oh, look, it's really worth it, I think, because it really brings home how that sudden and calamitous depreciation in 98, 99 really affected the country's psyche. So, you know, there's a sign there saying Bank Indonesia's central role is to protect the rupiah, and that the sense of the country's identity being caught up with the strength of its currency goes all the way through the population. I was just looking at some economist notes there, and they say, you know, there's been sort of a slight faltering in consumer confidence, and they attribute that to the prolonged depreciation of the rupiah, which is, of course, completely understandable because it's all, you know, about the Fed and what's the Fed's doing. You know, most currencies are down against the US dollar because of the carry trade. You know, the dollars go there to, you know, whoever's got the highest interest rate is where the dollars go, and at the minute that's where the Fed has. So it's, from macroeconomic terms, it's completely understandable. But, you know, even the little Warong owner would not like the fact that the rupiah is now trading down against the dollar. So that is a bit of a worry, and that will influence what Bank Indonesia does. I mean, it may come back. You know, we're looking as if inflation might be easing in the US, so that'll have the knock-on effect there. So there's a couple of factors, I guess, that could yet derail the Indonesia growth story. But if you're looking around the region at where the rebound has been strongest, I think you'd have to pick there. You know, Bali's going great guns again, all the international tourists coming back, except once again for the Chinese, so we'll wait and see what happens next year. I'd also pick out probably Thailand. Their tourism recovery has been really strong, and the Thai economy is very dependent on tourism. You know, depending on who you read, it's sort of between 12 and 15% of GDP. So that's come back stronger than people thought it might, because once again, they were just, you know, Southeast Asia as a whole was a bit later to reopen than Europe. So no one was sure if the Europeans would, you know, factor in Southeast Asia holidays, but it seems like they have. And also, interestingly, a lot of the tourism in Southeast Asia is intra. So we're getting, obviously, a lot of people from around the region moving and travelling. Like Changi Airport, I was just looking at some stats, you know, it's back to like 2/3 of its pre-pandemic capacity. They've reopened Terminal 2. They're talking about Terminal 5. So certainly there's a lot of people flying again. And in terms of other economies that have come back, you know, I've spent a bit of time in Vietnam this year, and Ho Chi Minh is just, there's such a buzz in the air in that city. I think it's always been there, and there was a short lockdown there that was pretty nasty, I think. And now I think everyone there is just going and grabbing at growth opportunities, and there's a lot of foreign investor interest in Vietnam as well. So they're probably the ones that I'd nominate. Singapore's done really well, but Singapore, like Australia, is so trade exposed. So the Monetary Authority here has just revised its forecast for next year down, I think it's as low as, between 0 and 2.5%, just because they're so affected by what's happening in those major markets, US, Europe and so on.
Yeah, so just saying that with the FDI interest in places like Vietnam, but we're seeing like infrastructure becoming a main tool piece for nations like Australia. We've talked about super funds coming into Indonesia and helping out there. How is the infrastructure going? Can it help bring a lot of these economies out of the potential downturn and insulate some of the risk associated with that to drive consumption and so on within the country? I know Indonesia's preparing for the new capital. There'll be a large-scale infrastructure piece. Is there a lot of other infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, with the new capital, I think, you have to say the jury's still out. There hasn't been anyone signing on the dotted line in terms of foreign investment going in there. I think there was supposed to be some from Abu Dhabi, but we haven't seen any more than sort of the memorandum of understanding level announcement. So whereas you are seeing, you're seeing Canadian pension funds going into tollways in Indonesia, you're seeing China's Silk Road Fund buying into pharmaceutical companies. You're seeing the INA teaming up with Pertamina to look at new gas fields. So there is hard investment coming into big, important infrastructure.
From an Australian perspective, where are businesses putting their money? Is it in places like Indonesia? Is it Vietnam? Is it Thailand?
Yeah, see, there's still, I think, Macquarie, now from memory, I think they bought into a project that is telco towers, which is very popular investment. I think they went into a consortium that was buying up some of those earlier this year, but that is still the one big Australian institutional investor that has gone into Indonesia. So, yeah, the super funds went up there, but there's been no movement since. But I think, we're still a long way from Australian superannuation funds actually investing in Indonesia. I think for the minute, it's been the sort of traditional Indonesia approach. Like, there's some really interesting small mining companies that are in there and some that are not so small. Like Australian Nickel Mines is a really interesting company.
Far East Gold as well.
Yeah. So they're connected to, right? There's cross shareholdings there, yeah.
There seems to be a big shift in, we've previously talked to some of the members of Austrade and so on. There's not a lot of a focus from the government of that miner owner-operator model. It's more how do we get Australian mets into Indonesia? That's really where the focus is and where they're going to grow it. It's a lot less risky. You don't have the divestment laws as well surrounding the ownership models of Indonesian mines. So I think that should probably be the way forward with how we look at a place like Indonesia. How do we accelerate these partnerships between Australian businesses and Southeast Asia? What are you noticing? Is there a bit of a step change in intensification? Are businesses becoming more happy and literal?
This is the question that people have been asking for about 20 years, I think. I think what's changed is the recognition that Australia is missing out because some of those ones who I mentioned, the Canadians are going in and, the INA is set up. So that gives investors some peace of mind around the traditional barriers that have been there that, concern the rule of law. I think I remember talking to an Australian who's been working in the Indonesian legal system, who said there's never been a case involving an Australian company in Indonesian courts that they've won. So, there have been these big barriers to entry, but now with the INA in particular, there seems to be paths to invest in Indonesia where those risks are very much minimised. And I think we are seeing other institutional investors, capital looking for return, heading to Indonesia. So, they've looked at the growth story and seen and recognised that Indonesia is a good place to put money, and Australia institutional investors are still not there. And the question is, what's holding them back, and are they valid concerns? Or is it more sort of inertia and, we just prefer to invest in OECD countries where everyone speaks English and, it's just a more comfortable place for us?
Yeah, coming off that point where everyone speaks English, do you think there's kind of this gap in the Australian labour market where people have ASCII literacy? So I know at the moment there's not many Australian Indonesian speakers. It's very difficult to find them, especially in the financial services realm. Is that kind of being a big roadblock at the moment?
On the the bilingual side of things, I think what's interesting in these markets too is, if you look across ASEAN, obviously Singapore, language isn't a barrier. Malaysia, it's definitely less of a barrier. But certainly in most of the other ASEAN countries, it has been. But I think Australians are still really bad at learning ASEAN languages, but ASEAN countries are getting much better at learning English. Just contrasting my visits to Vietnam and Thailand from, sort of this year compared to 3, 4, 5 years ago, there's a lot more English spoken. So they are crossing that bridge sooner than we are, I think.
How do you find forming relationships? I know a lot of people talk about being able to speak the language, you understand more about the culture, able to form those stronger bonds with people working as a journalist. How do you get by in terms of language?
Yes, so, we do use fixers. That's sort of the foreign correspondent's way. You link up with local journalists and, they help you find people and translate for you. Certainly, it'd be better if I had better language skills. If I had my time again, I would. But, the local journalists are fantastic.
Yeah, if you had your time again, you'd learn some Southeast Asian languages. What language would that be? Would that be a Bahasa? Would it be Vietnamese, Thai?
Yeah, no, I think it would be Bahasa just because of the number of people there. And, you can get by in Indonesia and Malaysia. And also I think, Indonesia, just because of the geography, I think a little bit of Bahasa gets you a long way.
Shifting the pace of the conversation at the moment, the energy transition in Southeast Asia, Indonesia signed the Just Transition. Albanese is also interested in getting more investment into Southeast Asia to support this transition. Where is Australia's role? Where do you think the Australian competitive advantage lies, and how likely is it for Australia to be one of those central pillars in Southeast Asia's energy market? Very
well placed to do that. I mean, there's a few areas, right? There's those critical minerals, but there's also, the nature of the Australian continent. We've got the land for big-scale solar and wind projects that, Singapore, for instance, doesn't have. We've also got the land for carbon sequestration. How do you say that?
Carbon capture.
Yeah, that's much easier. Capture.
It's much easier to say.
And there's some interesting trial projects going on there. And we also have, there's quite a lot of work that's being done on nature-based carbon credits. The Australian farming community is doing some really interesting work there and working with specialist investors. And there's obviously, so we can sort of fill quite a lot of that on the supply side. And of course, the demand is pretty well bottomless in terms of renewable energy and how to get there. So certainly, there's all these great dreams, I guess, of, a renewable energy powered Southeast Asia, but we don't know which technology is going to work out. Australia also obviously has, capital markets that are looking for which horse to back, so we have an advantage there as well. I think, things will be a lot clearer in a couple of years' time, perhaps. But at the minute, it's more like sort of the beginning of the dance and people sort of sidling up saying, would you like to? And people saying, yes, don't mind if I do, but we don't know how those waltzes are going to go, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's also some concerns over the grids as well, being able to take on the intermittent power from these renewables, which will be a role that maybe Australia can play.
Well, certainly we've been battling with that, right, for the last sort of 5 years or probably even longer in terms of feeding in solar power into the grid. So we're probably further advanced. Like I know that's been a big issue in Vietnam and Cambodia where there's quite a lot of hydro, but they can't feed it in to the grid. So, yes, certainly in terms of the macro management, you think Australia would have some strengths we could play on.
Yeah, who else but Sun Cable is interested in the region and doing work actively? The only really flagship program I hear project is Sun Cable. Is there any other Australian players? FFI had a little bit of stuff going on in Indonesia, but nothing's materialised.
Yeah, so I did get a chance to talk to Mr. Forrest about a project that he was interested in, this huge hydropower project in Kalimantan. But that's going ahead without him, okay? The Chinese and a Japanese investor are in there. He's sort of hopeful that maybe he'll get sort of a second bite at that, but at the minute, FFI is not there. But they are, I'm keen to talk to the company here. FFI has a base in Singapore, and I think they're exploring lots of interesting areas, but they haven't told us what they are yet.
Right. But they were also exploring some projects in Papua as well, some hydro-powered projects there. I know the Kalimantan one, is that the one linking up to the Green Energy Park in the north?
Yes. Yeah.
So would they really be the only other Australian player involved in that aspect of the energy market?
As far as I know, I suspect, there's people talking to each other we don't know about yet, but certainly they're the only ones we know of.
I know you're probably on a bit of a tight time frame today, but kind of advice for younger Australians looking to get involved in the region, whether it's going up to Southeast Asia, working, writing articles on their own accord as well. What should these younger people be doing when they look to progress their Southeast Asian knowledge, but also involvement?
Yeah, look, I think, I remember when I was at Lowy editing all these articles and they talk about people-to-people links, I think, oh, my God, what does that mean? But actually, after being here for a while, it really is about making relationships. And I think it's almost like it doesn't matter how those relationships are made, like, whether you do an exchange at university or come up and work on some sort of developmental project. There's some really interesting community development projects in Indonesia, that particularly in the area of low carbon economy and transitions. So that's another area. But I really don't think how it happens, as long as you sort of get up here in some way and meet, chat to the locals and just, form those friendships that's what drives people's lives and ultimately a lot of commercial activity, I think, and particularly here, and I think this is a lesson that some Australians perhaps haven't realised they don't know is, business is really about relationships. Like you really do have to sit down and talk to someone a few times and, know where their mother lives and how many kids they have and where their favourite warung is and, what they like to have for breakfast before things will progress. And that's something that you can pick up only really by being in the region, by physically being in the region. I think really Australians just need to stop flying over Southeast Asia to other places. They just need to stop in a bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is like WhatsApp as well. Everything revolves around WhatsApp here.
Yeah.
It's good to keep current as well. It's like you might not even be doing like a deal with someone or have a business relationship, but checking in, I found this article, or how's your family going, things like that go a long way.
Yeah. And I think, it's so rich and rewarding. And I think we all need to keep talking about not the word potential, but just how fantastic it is in the region. And I mean, yes, there is potential, but it's more, how great the people are and how interesting everything is. Like, there's so many different developments going on, and, it's all quite different to the way, we were brought up. So it's just a really, really fascinating place.
Yeah, I know so I'm currently studying in Yogyakarta at the moment, so this is the main university hub in Indonesia, but also a lot of Australian students come over. I think a lot of people were surprised what the region has to offer. Also, like the development status at the moment. You come to Indonesia and people have this perspective that Indonesia is completely undeveloped, but it provides everything you need. There's the western comforts of home, but there's also this exciting new experience that you'd never have access to being in Australia. So I think it's just that broadening the perspective on it. And a big thing here is just saying yes and taking hold of the different opportunities, because you never know where that will lead you.
Yeah, and it's so close. We're practically in the same time zone. Like, it's just astonishing, really. I've got this stat that still I find fascinating. When I was in Vietnam and the Assistant Minister for Trade was there, and he said, outward bound foreign direct investment in Indonesia from Australia is 2.5. So 2.5 of all the money that goes out of Australia into foreign countries goes into Asian countries. I mean, even if you break it down by the percentage of global GDP that's generated in ASEAN, which is 5.5%, we're clearly severely underinvested, and that's not even allowing for the fact that it's the fastest growing region, right? So
yeah. There used to be a stat out there of any G20 countries that are neighbours, Australia and Indonesia trade the least out of those nations. I know we've harped on about Indonesia today, but it's remarkable how little that relationship has progressed and materialised in terms of economic integration, trade and investment between the two nations. I think that's definitely an area that needs to be picked up. We're doing a lot of good work, a lot of money coming in Indonesia for development assistance and over Southeast Asia. But how does that transition into business relationships is something that I'm keen to understand how the Australian government will do going forward.
Well, I mean, interesting, we haven't spoken about that, right? This appointment of Nicholas Moore as the Southeast Asia envoy, which is a real business-focused role. I think it's a great appointment. Southeast Asia is impressed by people who have made their own money, and he certainly made a bucket through Macquarie, and he's obviously, so he knows the region well, and he's well connected, and I think that could be a real game changer in terms of influencing boardrooms in Australia.
Because it has to start at that boardroom level at home to get people going and understand that there is opportunity out there. They have so many different opportunities on their plate, so many things coming through the company, but it does need an advocate at that level to start kick-starting, driving the investment into Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and he'll be able to talk to boardrooms in the language they understand about, what's been done by the Investment Authority in Indonesia, the INA, and really get sort of breakthrough for that story in boardrooms across the country. So it is Tim Ayres, the Assistant Minister for Trade, who was in Vietnam and I spoke to, and he was talking about, the potential of Southeast Asia, and he gave me that stat on outward bound foreign direct investment.
Yeah, it does look like things are going in the right direction, and hopefully Australia and Southeast Asia can capitalise on that potential. Unfortunately, that is the end of our podcast today. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I've really enjoyed speaking all things Southeast Asia with you today, Emma. So thank you very much.
No worries.